So I've just had a little break and actually used a hairdryer to dry these patches of paint, because the other way to work is wet on dry. And what happens then is that if you're working on top of a layer of paint that you've allowed to dry, you'll get a different kind of edge. It'll be a crisp edge. And you can soften it up by adding water before you lay the paint down, but that'll have different impacts. So if I take a colour, a darker colour, and then go over this, you can see that those shapes are holding differently to the page, to the ones before. The edges are much crisper, and I'm working with the wet in wet as I do this as well. So I'm putting some kind of planted shapes in here, and then while it's still wet, I'm touching in a bit of darker colour at the bottom, and that's kind of blending out into what's just gone down before. So most watercolour will work with both wet in wet and wet on dry, and it's that kind of combination of edges that makes it very useful for things like landscapes. If you wanted to recreate a mistiness, you can put water over the top, but what will happen is it becomes quite hard to control what the paint will do, what the two layers will, how the two layers will interact. So say I wanted to have some kind of background tree type shape. Now, part of that unpredictability is what's very enjoyable about watercolours. Is you can't, I mean, you can get better at controlling it, but you can't precisely control what's going to happen between the two layers of paint, and you'll probably find that when this dries, there'll be a little bit of an edge around where this wet bit extended to. So one of the things that watercolour has a reputation for being difficult to work with, and I don't think it is actually difficult to work with, but what it requires is either an acceptance of the uncertainty or the kind of level of experience that will allow you to predict what might happen or what you can live with happening. So for example, this, because it's a tree, the uncertainty of this blotchiness is actually works quite well. But if I wanted to make something very smooth and flat, I would have to have done it differently. Another important thing to remember is that now I've got this here in this little sketch here, I'm not going to be able to make it lighter than it already is with the paint. So you have to work backwards, you have to work out in advance what your light areas are. So for example, if I wanted to paint, I don't know, let's say a teapot here, I can sketch it out first. Let's do that. So make a nice simple shape of a teapot. So I've sketched out my shape. I know approximately where I want things to go. And if I want to highlight, so say I'm imagining the light coming down and this area being lighter, I have to start with that in mind, and I have to leave the whiteness of the page to be my light. So if I'm going to make this teapot, say blue, I'm going to mix up a quite soft blue over here by adding a little bit of brown just to knock it back a bit. So sea blue. So I've got quite a dark colour there, and that will be great for some of it, but it's not going to work for the lights. So I'm going to add water to it. If you have a white in your selection of paints, I honestly suggest you don't use it, particularly with watercolour, because the way it works best is if your light comes from the page and the water. So I'm not working from life here, which we will be on Thursday, and so I will have a better idea. But you can see that I'm leaving my lightest area light right from the word go. So I'm sort of predicting that there'll be some light bits here and there. And then I can start to add darker colours. And as I say, I'm working while it's still wet. And so these two different areas, the light and the dark, should blend into each other quite nicely. And then if I was going to paint a pattern onto this, I would probably wait until it was drying. So I'm just going to lift out some of that there just to smooth it out. So remember, you can do as much lifting out as you do putting in, but you have to do it while your paint is still wet. And if you want a smooth surface, sometimes you have to work it a little bit, but can't do too much of that. So, and you can see that because I'm having to work quite quickly because I don't want my paints to dry, it's a good job that I mixed up a bunch of colour on my palette first. Watercolour, people quite often use those palettes that have little bowl-like dents in them because your paint is going to be quite liquidy. So I'm going to run out fairly soon, so I'm just quickly rushing to get the basis in, and while that's still wet I'm going to add a little bit more darkness, mixture of blue and brown, and the cat's woken up. And you can see that the paint's still wet enough for this darker colour to settle into the paint around it. And if I was then going to go on to add, say, a floral design onto it, I would then wait until all of this paint is dry and add it on afterwards. So now my teapot's dry, I could go on to paint let's say a floral design on the side. But what I can't do is add lightness to it unless I go over it with something like some gouache, which you can do, but the nice part of watercolours is getting into the habit of allowing the paper to do that work for you. So you're using the water and the spaces in the paper to create light, and that's why watercolours are very favoured for subjects like landscape, because their nature seems to kind of allow a lot of light to come into them. So yeah, the key things just for starting out, there's plenty more to learn, but key things for starting out with watercolour are the difference between working wet in wet and then wet on dry. So you get the difference between that sharp edge and that soft one. Deciding in advance that you know where your lightest areas are going to be and letting the page be those lightest areas. And the other thing is to use water, and whilst there's water in your image or on your page, you can sort of push the colours around. So let's just show you that again. So I've got a nice little colour here, make it very wet, and then I put some pink next to it. My brush wasn't very clean, so that's still quite purple, but never mind. And while these blobs of paint are wet, I'm moving the paint and the water around on the page. Now, like I say, for me, the fact that I don't know precisely how these bits are going to settle is what makes watercolours enjoyable. And if you dedicate a lot of time to it, you will be able to gain more and more control over it. But, for example, I love the way this yellow is pushing into the pink, and it's going to create an edge where the pink has been carried by the water. So have a little play, and we can do more if you want to. This is really just the very basics. Don't be afraid of it. Just bear in mind these very few points. 1, if you want to get soft edges, you work wet with wet. 2, if you want to get hard edges, you have to wait till your page is dry, your first layer is dry. 3, right from the word go, you have to locate your light areas and leave them light, because only the page will work to make highlights.